Welcome, traveler. You found third shift HFY. The story begins now. The observation sentry, Vigilance 9, sat in the cold silence of the void, a barnacle on the edge of the soul containment field. For 200 generations, the duty had been a death sentence of boredom. The jailers, members of the avian-descended Keraf, had long since stopped looking through the primary viewports. Why look at a wall that never changed? Officer Vane, not a man prone to imagination, stared at his console. The barrier was a shimmering veil of exotic matter, a masterpiece of physics that had held the unruly ones in a cage of light since the stars were young. Radiation levels holding at 0.4, Vane muttered, his voice raspy from disuse. He didn't check the telemetry. He didn't have to. The barrier was eternal. It was the only constant in a shifting universe. Then, the hum changed. It wasn't a sound, but a vibration in the marrow of Vane's bones. The shimmering veil outside didn't just flicker, it turned inward. The exotic matter, designed to reflect energy back into the Sol system, began to spiral. The light didn't fade, it condensed. Vane finally looked up. He expected a breach. He expected a frantic broadcast from a primitive fleet. He saw neither. Across the 5,000-year-old membrane, a fracture appeared. It looked like a crack in a frozen lake. Then, the barrier didn't break, it unzipped. The humans hadn't spent 5 millennia trying to break the lock. They had spent it learning how the lock was built. A single object emerged from the rift. It wasn't a starship with glowing engines or a sleek hull. It was a jagged, 3-kilometer slab of asteroid, reinforced with carbon nanotube bracing, and fitted with a single, massive thruster. It was a hunk of dead rock, moving at a significant fraction of the speed of light. Proximity alert, the computer chimed, its voice calm and indifferent. Vane reached for the alarm, but his hand stopped mid-air. He realized the terrifying truth of the human mindset. They hadn't wasted energy on lasers or shields for this opening move. They had simply taken the very cage that held them and used its collapse as a slingshot. The asteroid didn't fire a shot. It didn't need to. Its mass, accelerated by the snapping tension of the collapsing barrier, carried the kinetic energy of a dying sun. The Vigilance 9 didn't explode. It was simply erased. One moment it was a triumph of galactic engineering. The next, it was a spray of subatomic dust, pushed aside by a 3-kilometer rock that didn't even slow down. Behind the rock, the rift stayed open, and from the darkness of the dead zone, the lights of 1,000 more engines began to ignite. The debt was due. The bridge of the United Terror ship Sisyphus's Hammer was not a place of polished chrome or holographic displays. It was a reinforced bunker carved into the heart of a 3-kilometer nickel-iron asteroid. The air smelled of ozone, recycled sweat, and the metallic tang of 5,000 years of waiting. Commander Elias Thorne did not sit in a captain's chair. He stood bolted to the deck plates in a magnetic harness, his arms crossed over a chest protector made from salvaged containment plating. His face was a roadmap of scars and radiation burns, the legacy of a life spent turning a prison into a forge. On the main tactical screen, a thick slab of armored glass showing a monochrome feed from external cameras. The dust cloud that used to be the Keraf sentry station was already dissipating. "Impact confirmed," said a voice from the sensor pit, a woman whose name Thorne had forgotten, or perhaps never learned. "Kinetic transfer complete. The barrier integrity is 0. Thorne didn't nod. He just watched the debris field expand. He felt no triumph. Triumph was an emotion for people who hadn't spent 50 centuries eating algae paste and breathing recycled air. This was just physics. "Fleet status," Thorne said, his voice like grinding gears. "Deployment is underway, Commander. All 50 breacher units are through the gap. Trajectory confirmed for the first target system, the Keraf core worlds." Thorne finally unclamped his harness and walked to the viewport. It was a narrow slit in the rock, shielded by transparent aluminium. looking out at the void. The stars, once a ceiling, were now a map. "They built a wall of light to keep us in," Thorn said, more to the reflection in the glass than to his crew. "They forgot that if you push against a wall long enough, you don't just break it. You learn exactly how much force it takes to break everything else they've ever built." He turned from the viewport, his eyes as cold as the vacuum outside. "Signal the fleet. No transmissions, no decorations. We are not here to talk. We are here to collect. The march begins now." The Keraf outpost at Olaris was a spire of crystalline grace, a hub of commerce that had stood for 3 millennia. It was built for aesthetics, for the light of its twin suns to dance off its translucent hulls. To the Keraf, war was a distant memory, a chapter in a history book about the Great Locking. That history became the present when the first human tug entered the system. On the Olaris command deck, High Exarch Vora watched to sense a ghost. There was no warp-in flash, no elegant slipstream exit. The human vessel simply existed where a moment ago there was empty space, a side effect of the folding drive tech they'd perfected in the high-pressure furnace of the Sol system. "Identify yourselves," Vora broadcasted. Her voice was melodic, chirping with the inherent superiority of a jailer. "You have entered a restricted sovereign zone. Power down, or be dismantled." The response was a data burst. It wasn't a message. It was a mathematical proof. On the Sisyphus's hammer, Commander Thorn watched the crystal spire on his monitors. To him, it wasn't a city or a home. It was a structural weakness. "The station uses a gravitic stabilizer to maintain its orbit, sir," the sensor tech reported. "If we tap it—" "Don't tap it," Thorn interrupted. "Invert it." The humans didn't fire a single missile. Instead, the hammer and 4 escort slabs deployed anchors, massive coils of superconducting wire salvaged from the very barrier that had imprisoned them. They projected a localized, intense gravitational shear. The Keraf had spent 5,000 years refining shields that blocked light and heat. They had nothing that could block the fundamental pull of mass. Vora felt the floor tilt. Then the screaming started, not from the people, but from the station itself. The crystalline struts, beautiful and brittle, began to moan. Everything is a weapon philosophy took hold. The humans weren't attacking the station. They were using the station's own mass to crush itself. The Olaris spire didn't explode. It shattered like a dropped wine glass. Millions of tons of crystalline commerce were pulled into a tight, swirling vortex of debris. Thorn watched the tactical feed as the debris cloud began to accelerate. "The Keraf homeworld is 3 light hours away," Thorn noted. "The station's remains are now on an intercept trajectory. We didn't just clear the path, we just gave them a 3 million ton warning." He turned away before the first crystalline shards hit the atmosphere of the planet below. He wasn't interested in the fireworks. He was already looking at the next coordinates on the star map. The march didn't pause for tragedy. The sky over Krathus Prime, usually a serene and motionless violet, was now a jagged mosaic of fire. The Olaris storm had arrived. Not as a fleet of ships, but as 3 million tons of hypervelocity crystal shards, the pulverized remains of their own pride. In the High Command atrium, Counselor Tishon watched the orbital feeds. The holographic displays were flickering, struggling to track the sheer volume of incoming projectiles. These weren't missiles with signatures to lock onto. They were just rocks and glass, invisible to sensors designed for high-tech warfare. "Planetary shields at maximum!" a technician shrieked, his crest feathers flattened against his skull in a primal display of terror. "The shields are designed to dissipate thermal energy and refracted light," Tishon replied, his voice brittle. "They are not designed to stop a mountain of solid matter moving at atmospheric entry speeds." The first shard, a section of the station's primary docking pylon, the size of a city block, hit the Great Southern Ocean. The impact didn't just create a wave, it punched a hole in the crust. The resulting shockwave was a physical fist that shattered every window in the command atrium miles away. Tishon didn't flinch as the glass rain fell around him. He looked at his personal terminal. A single signal was overriding the planetary emergency frequency. It wasn't a video of a conqueror, and there was no audio of a war cry. It was a spreadsheet. Row after row of data scrolled past. Stolen solar output, 5,000 years. Kinetic energy deficit, calculated. Interest, applied. The humans weren't just attacking, they were balancing the ledger. They had calculated exactly how much energy the Great Barrier had drained from their sun to keep them imprisoned, and they were returning every single joule of that energy in the form of kinetic impact. Another shard, this one glowing white hot, leveled the Ministry of Culture. The building didn't burn. It simply ceased to exist, as the kinetic energy turned the stone into a fine molecular mist. The Keraf had spent 5 millennia feeling safe because they were the ones with the key. They had forgotten the most basic rule of the universe. If you trap a predator in a box and starve it, you don't get a disciplined prisoner. You get a monster that has spent every second of those 5,000 years thinking of exactly how to use the box to kill you. Tishon looked up as the ceiling of the atrium began to buckle under the weight of the atmospheric displacement. "They aren't even here yet," he whispered to the roaring wind. "This is just the debris from the door hitting the floor." The dust from the Olaris storm hadn't even settled before the rain began. Crazed defense batteries, ancient, ornate towers that fired beams of pure, coherent light, targeted the incoming human drop pods. The beams struck true, but the pods didn't shatter. They were coated in an ablative heat shielding made from the compressed remains of the very containment field that had kept Sol dark. The human tech didn't resist the Keraf lasers. It absorbed the thermal energy to power its own descent thrusters. High Exarch Vora stood in the ruins of the capital's landing plaza, her ceremonial robes scorched and tattered. She clutched a kinetic sidearm, a weapon that felt like a toy in her trembling talons. A pod slammed into the plaza 50 yards away. It wasn't a sleek vessel. It was a brutal hexagonal spike of industrial-grade tungsten. There were no hatches. There were no diplomatic ramps. The spike simply exploded outward, the side panels acting as claymore lines that cleared a 300-foot radius of any standing Keraf architecture and any Keraf soldiers. From the hollowed center of the spike, a human stepped out. The soldier wasn't wearing the shimmering energy suits the Keraf expected of a spacefaring race. This was a reclaimer. The suit was a massive, hulking frame of lead-lined ceramic plates, looking more like deep-sea diving gear or heavy mining equipment than a uniform. It was built to survive the high-gravity crush of the Sol system's asteroid refineries. The reclaimer didn't raise a rifle. He raised a heavy, vibrating industrial tool, a molecular debonder. "State your surrender," Vora screamed, her voice cracking. "We are a protected species under the Galactic Accord." The reclaimer's helmet didn't have a faceplate, just a slit for a sensor array. A voice, centralized and devoid of any warmth, echoed from the suit's external speakers. "The Accord was signed 4,000 years after you buried us," the human said. "We don't recognize the paperwork of a graveyard." The reclaimer drove the molecular debonder into the ground. A low-frequency hum rippled through the plaza. The ornate crystalline pavement began to vibrate, then liquefy. "What are you doing?" Vora gasped, stumbling back as the very ground beneath her began to lose its molecular cohesion. "You took 5,000 years of our history," the human replied, his boots locking into the destabilized ground. "We're taking the lithium from your crust. We need it for the next leg of the march." Across the planet, thousands of these spikes were doing the same. The humans weren't occupiers. They were scavengers on a planetary scale. They weren't there to rule the Keraf. They were there to disassemble their world for parts. To the humans, Kerafis Prime wasn't a home. It was a refueling station. The chamber of the Eternal Concord was a cathedral of arrogance. Built into a hollowed-out moon at the center of the galaxy's most stable star system, its walls were lined with the history of 5,000 years of peace, a peace bought with the light of a single, stolen sun. In the center of the room, a massive holographic sphere displayed the galactic map. For 50 centuries, the Sol system had been represented by a dead grey void, a null zone. Now, that void was bleeding. "The telemetry from Keraf Prime is inconsistent," whispered High Counselor Zine. He was a spindly, translucent being whose race had specialized in the mathematics of containment. He adjusted his ocular lenses, staring at the data stream. "The planet's mass is decreasing. By the second, this shouldn't be possible. Where is their fleet?" demanded a representative from the militant Valkyrie. He slammed a heavy fist onto the obsidian console. "The Keraf had 3 orbital battle groups. But why haven't they engaged?" Zine looked up, his multiple eyes blinking in a sequence that signaled pure, unadulterated shock. "They didn't engage a fleet, Counselor. They engaged a physics problem. The humans used the Keraf's own orbital infrastructure as a kinetic shotgun. The battle groups were shredded by the very docking pylons they were supposed to defend. The chamber fell into a silence so heavy it felt physical. These were beings who viewed war as a series of tactical trades, shields versus beams, speed versus armor. They were looking at a species that didn't play the game. They simply broke the board and used the splinters to blind their opponent. "We need to activate the secondary contingency," Jean said, his voice barely a rasp. "We must reseal the rift. We must pour every ounce of energy from the surrounding sectors into a new barrier." "With what power?" A voice echoed from the shadows of the upper tier. An ancient archivist stepped forward, clutching a data table that dated back to the incident. "The humans didn't just break out," the archivist said, his voice trembling. "They inverted the polarity of the original containment nodes. They've turned our own lock into a siphon. Every megajoule we try to send to the Sol sector is being redirected. They aren't just taking the Keraf's lithium. They are eating the Council's power grid." On the holographic map, the grey void wasn't just expanding, it was turning red. A jagged line of light was tracing the path the human fleet was taking, a direct, uncompromising vector toward the Council moon. The archivist looked at the everything as a weapon doctrine flickering on his screen. 5,000 years ago, we locked them away because they were too volatile for the galaxy, the archivist whispered. "We thought we were protecting the universe from their rage. We were wrong. We weren't a jail. We were a pressure cooker. And now, the lid has come off." The Council moon, Ethelgard, was protected by the Star Guard, 12 rings of automated defense platforms, each capable of cracking a continent. It was the most heavily fortified point in known space, anchored at the center of a gravitational well that made unauthorized folding drives impossible to use. High Counselor Zine stood at the panoramic observation deck, watching what used to be the dead zone sector on the long-range scanners. The space was empty. No warp signatures, no heat blooms. The gravitational anchors are holding, the Star Guard commander reported, his voice tight with a desperate kind of hope. "Nothing can drop into this system without being torn apart by the tidal forces. We have the high ground." Jean didn't respond. He was watching a small, insignificant flicker on the edge of the system's primary star. The humans didn't drop into the system. They didn't have to. Suddenly, the gravitational anchors didn't just fail. They shrieked. The Star Guard platforms began to spin wildly, their gyroscopes overloading as the weight of the system's star seemed to shift. The humans hadn't brought a fleet to the Council. They had brought the Sol barrier. Using the siphoned energy from the Keraf sector, the humans had projected a ghost of their own 5,000-year prison ahead of them. They had turned the very physics of their confinement into a massive, mobile lens. They were focusing the gravity of the local sun and aiming it directly at the Council moon, like a magnifying glass hitting an ant. "The first ring is collapsing," the commander yelled. Outside, the massive defense platforms, the pride of the galaxy, began to grind against one another. They weren't being shot. They were being pulled into each other by a localized gravity well the size of a planet. The beautiful rings of Aethelgard became a churning meat grinder of screaming metal and exploding reactors. Then, through the center of the wreckage, the Sisyphus's hammer emerged. It wasn't alone. Behind it came the Grey Fleet, thousands of ships that looked less like vessels and more like flying factories. They were black, jagged, and covered in the scars of a civilization that had learned to build in the dark. The hammer didn't slow down. It plowed through the remains of a billion-credit defense platform as if it were driftwood. On the bridge of the hammer, Commander Thorn looked at the Council moon. It was a beautiful, shimmering pearl of a world. "They spent 5,000 years watching us through a window," Thorn said. He didn't use a radio. He knew the Council's sensors were picking up the vibration of his voice through the gravitational lens. "It's only fair we let them see what the view looks like from the other side." The Sisyphus's hammer came to a dead halt, exactly 1 kilometer from the Council's observation deck. The massive asteroid ship loomed over the glass like a tombstone. A single transmission flickered onto the Council screens. It wasn't a list of demands. It was a timer. 59. 58. The humans weren't there to negotiate. They were waiting for the bill to be paid in full. The timer on the Council's screens didn't flash or beep when it hit 00. It simply vanished, replaced by a single word in the ancient, blocky script of old Earth: reclaim. High Chancellor Zhen braced himself for a nuclear flash or lance of thermal energy. Instead, the Sisyphus's hammer did something far more terrifying. It breathed. A series of massive hydraulic vents along the asteroid's jagged hull slammed open. Thousands of tether lines, each a thick cable of braided carbon nanotubes tipped with gravitic anchors, shot forward. They didn't target the defense towers. They targeted the moon's structural foundation. The anchors bit deep into the pristine white stone of the Council moon, buried themselves miles into the crust, and locked. "They're harpooning us," the Starguard commander whispered, his voice trembling. The Sisyphus's hammer ignited its primary engines, not to move forward, but to pull back. The massive asteroid ship groaned as it began to act as a celestial winch. Along with the thousands of smaller grave ships in the fleet, humanity began to literally pull the Council moon apart. The collection was not a bombardment. It was a harvest. As the crust of Aethelgard began to buckle and peel away under the impossible tension, smaller human collector drones swarmed the gaps. They ignored the Council's panicked guards. They ignored the vaults of gold and precious gems. They headed straight for the great archive of the stars. Inside the archive, the librarian, a being who had curated the galaxy's knowledge for centuries, watched as a human reclaimer suit smashed through the reinforced crystal ceiling. The human didn't reach for the artifacts. He plugged a massive, industrial-grade data spike into the central core. "You cannot take this," the librarian shrieked. "This is the history of 1,000 civilizations." "Correction," the human's mechanical voice boomed, the sound vibrating the very air. "This is 5,000 years of data collected while we were forced to live in a dark room. You kept the logs. We're taking the entries." The data spike hummed, and the lights in the archive began to dim as the sum total of the galaxy's knowledge was sucked into the human ship's banks. Outside, the Sisyphus's hammer gave one final violent tug. A massive chunk of the Council moon, the sector containing the primary power regulators and the atmospheric processes, was ripped clean away. Commander Thorn watched from his bridge as the stolen moon began to disintegrate. The humans weren't just taking resources. They were taking the very infrastructure of the Council's power. "The debt isn't settled with blood," Thorn said, watching 1,000,000 tons of Council technology being hauled into the maws of the human factory ships. "It's settled with the return of everything you built while we were gone." The Council moon, once the shining jewel of the galaxy, was now a hollowed-out shell, its atmosphere bleeding into the void, its secrets gone, and its pride being ground into scrap by the very species it had tried to forget. The march through worlds had reached its destination. But the humans weren't stopping. They were just getting started on the rebuild. The screens across the remaining council sectors didn't show a fleet. They didn't show explosions. They showed a single, steady feed from the bridge of the Sisyphus's hammer. Commander Thorn stood perfectly still. The cold, flickering light of the Council Noon's dying power grid played across his scarred features. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a man who had finally finished a long, exhausting day of work. When he spoke, his voice wasn't raised in anger. It was a low, resonant rasp, the sound of a predator that had finally stopped chasing and started eating. 5,000 years. Thorn began, his eyes boring into the camera as if you could see every counselor trembling in their bunkers. That is how long you watched us. You sat in your gardens, bathed in the light of stars you didn't earn, and congratulated yourselves on your mercy. You thought the barrier was a wall to keep the monsters in. You were wrong. He leaned forward, the magnetic clamps of his suit hissing in the silence. A wall is just a blueprint. For 50 centuries we lived in the dark he provided. We didn't pray for rescue. We didn't waste time on hope. We spent every hour, every minute, every heartbeat studying the grain of the wood in the box you put us in. We learned your physics. We learned your weaknesses. We learned exactly how much your peace cost and raw energy. Thorn paused, a ghost of a cold, Scorpio dark smile touching his lips. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was the satisfaction of a math problem finally solved. You wanted us out of sight because you feared our volatility. But by locking us away, you gave us the one thing humanity never had: focus. You took away our distractions. You took away our sun. You left us with nothing but our capacity to turn anything into a weapon. We have spent 50 centuries becoming the very nightmare you tried to prevent. Behind him, the tactical screen showed the Grey Fleet beginning to move, not back towards Sol, but outward, fanning out into the heart of the galaxy. The debt is collected. We have your history, your power, and your scrap. We are no longer the incident in your history books. We are the architects of the next era. You gave us 5,000 years to think about what we would do when we walked among the stars again. Thorn straightened his back, his hand hovering over the end transmission command. The audit is over. Now, the occupation begins. Don't bother looking for the key to the cage. We brought the cage with us, and the galaxy is a much smaller place than you remember. The screen went black.